What's up, everybody? It's your favorite reveals, favorite nerd, and today we are looking at some of the recent third-party reveals. Now, there wasn't necessarily an event per se, although there was an exhibit overseas, but there's just been a lot to be revealed recently, so I figured it was worth the time, worth the effort to kind of cover some of it. Plus, per usual, the releases have been slower, so why not take a quick second out of our day and think about stuff that's coming in the future? Now, I compare this to going to the dentist, and the obvious question is to why. So the dentist isn't exactly a pleasurable trip for most. In fact, most dread it, don't look forward to it, have a bit of anxiety about it, etc., etc., etc. This is no different. Therefore, much like the dentist where they start with taking a metal hook and scraping it against your teeth and gum lines, we're going to get the painful stuff out of the way first, which is to say, the movieverse stuff. Toy World has recently released colored images of two of their molds that they have shown in the past. Under their Cars of World War II line, which seem to be kind of inspired by The Last Knight, we have a yellow and green rendition of a Bumblebee type character. I don't know too much about the green version. And I guess maybe to be fair, I don't know too much about the yellow either, but I suppose it's still worth addressing. They're obviously timepieces. They're of a particular time, and the cars reflect that. You can arm them up to the teeth because it's a transformer, and that's part of doing business. The other part of doing business is transforming into a robot. Now, these robots kind of follow the typical movie-esque design with all sorts of moving parts and pieces and bits and pistons and gears and etc., etc. But there's two things that jumped out to me immediately. One of which was the super angry face sitting in the middle of their chest. The second of which was the weathering paint job they did. Now, I'll be curious to see if this is done as well in the final versions that end up being available for retail, but this is how weathering is supposed to be done. The Siege line could take a look at this and boil down a few helpful hints for themselves. But look at the subtle edge line weathering of both silver and rust, which is wonderfully dictating both age and wear and tear. It looks like they left no stone unturned in regards to the paint, and you know as much as I do, I'm a sucker for that. So while I have no interest in this line, I do have to commend them for the effort it took to accomplish this. Now that we've got the teeth scraped off, let's go ahead and have a look at our gum line, and that is this Transcraft piece, which is a representation of Mohawk from The Last Knight, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll be honest with you, it won't really mean a whole lot to me. And I'm sure this thing looks appropriate, which is to say accurate, and I say that to say this: it's making me slightly sick to my stomach, to such an extent that I'm curious if perhaps I have a legitimate allergy in regards to it. I can appreciate the attention to detail and the sculpt, but I've had some ugly friends in my life, and I wouldn't necessarily want a sculpt of them either, even if it was done accurately. But we'll see how it turns out. And lastly, we'll go ahead and polish up those teeth, but we're going to start with the gum line, so it's still relatively painful, and that is Transformed Elements movie Bumblebee from the self-titled film. This looks super accurate, and Transform Element makes a good product, or at least they have in the past. Now, what I am curious about ultimately is the success of this product, because I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm slightly bummed out that they didn't continue in their G1 motif. Partly because I'm selfish, and partly because not many companies are making G1 Masterpiece anymore, so it would have been nice to have a new contender in the arena. But as we've discussed on this channel numerous times, it's not so much about the dedication to the line, it's about the dedication to the profit margins, and the profit margins are best represented with Optimus Prime and Bumblebee. Therefore, Transform Element takes a big, broad old stroke of a brush and goes check, check. Now let's have a little bit of a change of pace. And I do mean little, am I right? Let's talk about Iron Factory, who showed two recent reveals recently. One of their Bludgeon, which I admit does look good, and I love the demon face in the middle of the chest. Definitely harkens to that samurai motif, and I'm sure it'll be built well, as most of their products are. However, what I do find troublesome about it aesthetically is that extension in the abdomen area. Now, I'm sure it has something to do with the engineering, and I applaud them for doing so. However, I do find it to be unsightly, and the only thing that I do hope is that it's not an aesthetic sacrifice in order to pull off this spider mode, which is probably unneeded and unnecessary to begin with. Now let's move on to their Leo convoy. Now this, I think, looks great. I think all the pieces work well, and I think the design looks cool, and it happens to be the second third-party release of this representation of the character that I feel like looks better than the Takara Masterpiece, which I personally think looks dreadful, but that's certainly a subjective thing. I just don't know how you could choose between this and the Perfect Effect and choose this. hips. Whatever floats your boat at the end of the day, and if you like it, you win. But I just can't understand it. I just can't wrap my head around it. I feel like you want to go out and buy the black and white television, and then you're trying to tell me that you prefer it over the 4K. But hey, it's your decision to make. Now let's stay in the realm a little, fellas, and we'll dig a bit deeper with Newage, who released a ton of stuff, including their Megatron. Now what I think is cool about their Megatron is that they're releasing two different versions of it. One will be a more toy-accurate version, and one will be a more cartoon-accurate version. And both of them, I think, look good. I have to say, there's a lot of things about the toy-accurate version that appeal to me more, such as the red components and the silver finish. However, I've never been crazy about the chest hair. Now, the G1 looks good as well. I'm just not sure I find it to be a striking design. Now, to continue down this path, the one thing that I do find to be unsightly is the way they've engineered the hips. There's just something that doesn't look quite right about the finished product, and I think it would be easy to chalk that up and say, well, it's going to be a difficult engineering feat, and they probably had to make sacrifices, but we'll return to that here in a second. The one last thing I want to comment on regarding this Megatron is the throne and how close they're willing to push the boundaries of the edge, and I'd advise them to be careful. They also revealed their cone heads, which I think look good. They have a nice firm grip on aesthetic cues and how to make something visually pleasing, as well as their seeker. The problem with all of this stuff is that at the same time, Magic Square released theirs. Now let's take a look back at Megatron's hips, for example. I think they did it much better. I also love the Lincoln Memorial Throne. I think that's a smart touch. Quite clever indeed. But I think that it's fair to say that both of these are really impressive in terms of engineering and how much they've been able to hide. If we look at the Legends Megatrons of earlier years and just how far we've come from the DX9 and Generation Toy era. Now they also released their Soundwave, their Rumble and Frenzy, well, whichever one ends up being blue anyway will be the Rumble, Ravage and Laserbeak, and their Seeker mode. Now their Seeker mode I think is much more accurate to the G1 model if that's something that you're going for regarding Legends. I think that Legends class figures actually display the G1 aesthetic much more successfully than Masterpiece does, so I would totally understand if that was going to be your route of travel. And they also showed their Reflector, which I think looks fantastic. It's so funny, I think growing up as a kid, Reflector was kind of like, you know, not the forbidden fruit, but like the holy grail, you know, because you had to mail away for them. It wasn't available mass retail. You played such a big part, or they played such a big part in the original season of G1, and then the toys looked so vastly different than the cartoon. So I think it's always, I don't know, it's always nice and pleasing and kind of exciting to me to see a modern Reflector that reflects, so to speak, the G1 cartoon aesthetic. Now lastly, Toy World has jumped back in the game apparently with two releases of their upcoming Predacons set that they teased about a year ago with little cartoon animations, but the two kind of prototypes that they've released have been of Tantrum and Rampage. And there's a lot I want to say about this. So let's get some of the big stuff out of the way. On one hand, I think that this is too far left of center in regard to original design. So I don't know even how much of it still even evokes the feelings of the G1 set, which I feel like they're trying to put their finger on. Now, I say that to say this. There's something else I notice about all this as I'm looking at these images, and we'll start with Tantrum. Just the layers of metals but on the chest, and when I say that, I'm speaking figuratively. Obviously, it's plastic. The design of the head, the shape of the torso and arms, the accessories and the way that the accessories integrate and create gimmicks. Moving on to Rampage. Once again, the chest design, the shoulder design, the arm design, the head design, all of this seems very familiar to me. And all of it, to me, reeks of TFC. I smell TFC all over this thing. Now, I don't know if it's the same designer or perhaps a designer that's very influenced by what TFC has done in the past, but this looks like TFC spelled differently to me, and it's spelled Toyworld. If news came out in a week that the reporting of this information was mistranslated somewhere down the line, and this was actually a new TFC release, would anyone be surprised? I feel like even though TFC has done a Predaking in the past, this is much more congruent with their design than it is in what we know of Toy World. Now, obviously, their main designers as of late have left and moved on, but even their designs of the past, this doesn't seem to fit in. However, it does look a lot like their Seacons from TFC to me, so I don't know about this. Now, there's another thing that I found interesting, and I like it, and that is on Tantrum. The rear legs look like a mess, but you know what? They didn't hide it, and cheers on them for that. The last thing I want to touch on, though, is this promotional image that they released. Now, I've heard people say that they've also teased a kind of Gorilla or Optimus Primal type design, but the marketing of this, and it's under Kang Toys, which is even more confusing to me, because everyone's calling it Toy World. It looks like TFC, but it's called Kang Toys. I don't know. Maybe I'm out of the loop, which is severely possible. But they have Predaking in the back. They have Tantrum and Rampage being the next biggest thing in the middle, which makes sense because that's their finished prototypes. That's what they'd want the eye to be drawn to. And then in the front, they show 4 more designs. What I'm guessing to be Razor Claw, Headstrong, Dive Bomb, and this Gorilla. Now, maybe that is this Primal that I'm just not super aware of. It just seems like very confusing marketing. To me, looking at this with a pair of fresh eyes, the first thing I would think is that they're doing a 6-member Predacon team with a Gorilla being the 6th member. I just find it all to be quite bizarre. There's a lot of confusion surrounding this set, in my opinion. That being said, I am predicting that it will be old school combining, which means I'll definitely be out because I just don't have any interest in that anymore. I think that if you do like super stylized versions of these characters, that they probably will scratch that itch for you. I just think it might be a bit much for me personally. I am looking forward to that Zeta set though. So anyway, hope that was informative, entertaining, and perhaps even enjoyable. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.